The morning sun streamed through the modest stained glass windows of St. Mary's Chapel, casting gentle rainbows across the weathered wooden pews where the faithful gathered for Sunday service. Father Samuel Cross stood behind his simple pulpit, his gray beard neatly trimmed, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his weathered nose as he read from the worn leather Bible that had served this frontier congregation for nearly 2 decades. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had seen much of life, speaking words of forgiveness and redemption to the 23 souls who had braved the dusty streets of Harmony Creek this particular morning. In the front pew sat Martha Whitfield, a widow of 32 whose husband had died in a mining accident the previous spring. Her twin daughters, Lucy and Emma, both 8 years old, sat quietly beside her with their small hands folded in their laps, their Sunday dresses pressed and clean despite the family's modest circumstances. Behind them, old Henrik Larsson dozed fitfully in his usual spot, his gnarled hands folded over his walking stick. The blacksmith's wife, Catherine Wells, sat with her teenage son Timothy, who fidgeted with his collar and cast longing glances toward the open chapel doors where freedom beckoned. Near the back, 3 elderly widows whispered quietly among themselves until Father Samuel's gentle gaze reminded them of proper reverence. The sermon this morning focused on the parable of turning the other cheek, Father Samuel's measured words speaking of mercy for those who had wronged us, of finding peace through forgiveness rather than retribution. His voice carried a particular weight when he spoke of violence begetting violence, of the cycle of hatred that could only be broken through the grace of understanding. Before you find out what happens when this peaceful sanctuary is invaded, tell me in the comments what state or country you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories of faith and redemption travel across the world. Father Samuel was midway through explaining how even the most hardened hearts could find salvation when the distant thunder of approaching horses began to shake the small chapel's foundation. At first, the congregation paid little attention, accustomed to the occasional traveler passing through their small town. But the sound grew closer, more urgent, accompanied by whoops and hollers that spoke of men with violence on their minds. Timothy Wells straightened in his pew, his young face turning pale as he recognized the particular cadence of riders who meant trouble. Martha Whitfield instinctively pulled her daughters closer, their small bodies pressing against her sides as the thundering hooves grew louder still. Father Samuel paused in his reading, his pale blue eyes lifting toward the chapel doors with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural given the approaching menace. The riders were close enough now that individual voices could be distinguished, crude laughter mixing with the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather gun belts. Someone outside shouted about easy pickings and Sunday collections, words that sent a chill through every person in the modest chapel. Father Samuel closed his Bible slowly, his weathered hands steady as he placed the sacred book on the pulpit's edge. Then the chapel doors exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the sacred space like thunder. Dust and splinters filled the air as 6 armed men on horseback forced their way through the entrance, their animals snorting and stamping on the wooden floor that had never before been violated by such intrusion. The lead rider, a man of perhaps 30 years with cruel dark eyes and a scraggly black beard, wore a wide-brimmed hat tilted at an arrogant angle. His name was Jake Morrison, and his reputation for cruelty preceded him through every town within 100 miles. Morrison's companions spread out behind him, their weapons already drawn, revolvers gleaming in the morning sunlight that still streamed peacefully through the stained glass windows. These were men who had chosen a life outside the law, their faces marked by years of violence and whiskey, their eyes holding the particular emptiness of souls that had long ago abandoned any pretense of mercy or redemption. The congregation froze in their pews like rabbits before wolves, their morning prayers forgotten in the face of immediate mortal terror. Little Lucy Whitfield began to whimper, the sound quickly muffled by her mother's trembling hand. Old Henrik Larsson gripped his walking stick so tightly his knuckles went white, while Catherine Wells wrapped her arms protectively around her son's shoulders. Morrison's horse pranced nervously in the confined space, knocking over the collection box near the entrance and sending coins scattering across the floor with metallic rings that seemed obscenely loud in the terrified silence. The outlaw leader's gaze swept across the huddled congregation with the predatory satisfaction of a man who had found easy prey exactly where he expected to find it. The chapel that had moments before been filled with words of peace and salvation now reeked of horse sweat, gun oil, and the particular stench of men who lived hard lives under the open sky. Morrison's companions kept their weapons trained on the congregation while their leader's attention fixed on the elderly preacher who still stood behind his pulpit with remarkable composure. Father Samuel stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, his hands visible as he approached the edge of the raised platform where he had been delivering his sermon. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the same gentle authority that had been reading scripture moments before, unmarked by fear despite the weapons pointed in his direction. "Sir," he said quietly, his pale eyes meeting Morrison's dark ones without flinching, "I must ask you to respect this sacred place. These good people have come here seeking peace and spiritual comfort. Surely whatever business brings you to our town can wait until after our worship has concluded." Morrison's response was a bark of harsh laughter that echoed off the chapel walls like a physical blow. His horse shifted beneath him, hooves scratching against the wooden floor as he leaned forward in his saddle with a grin that revealed yellowed teeth marked by years of tobacco and neglect. Morrison's laughter died away into something far more sinister as his gaze swept across the terrified congregation like a man appraising livestock at market. He dismounted with deliberate slowness, his spurs jangling against the wooden floor with each step, the sound echoing through the chapel like tiny bells announcing the arrival of some dark angel. His companions followed suit, leaving their horses to wander freely through the sacred space, the animals snorting and stamping as they knocked over hymnal stands and scattered the simple wooden chairs that had been arranged for the children's Sunday school. "What we got here, boys," Morrison called out to his men, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed causing fear. "Looks like we struck the mother lode. Sunday collection day in a God-fearing town. These holy folks been saving up their pennies all week just for us." The outlaw's companions spread out through the chapel like wolves through a sheep pen, their weapons still drawn as they began systematically destroying everything within reach. One man, a scarred brute named Caleb Pike, used the barrel of his Colt to sweep the modest collection of religious artifacts from the altar, sending brass candlesticks and a simple wooden cross clattering to the floor. The metallic crash seemed to physically strike the huddled congregation, several of the elderly women crying out in distress at the desecration. Another gang member, a wiry man with dead eyes called Tommy Nash, grabbed the church Bible from Father Samuel's pulpit and began tearing out pages with deliberate malice, letting the thin sheets flutter to the floor like dying butterflies. His laughter mixed with Pike's as he held up torn passages about mercy and redemption before crumpling them in his fist. "Look here, Jake," Nash called to his leader, "the old book's got some real pretty words about forgiveness. Think these folks gonna forgive us for what we're about to do?" Morrison's attention had already shifted to the congregation itself, his predatory gaze settling on Martha Whitfield and her twin daughters with the focused intensity of a hunting cat. The widow had pressed herself back against the pew, trying to make herself and her children as small as possible, but there was nowhere to hide in the modest chapel. Her daughters clung to her skirts, their young faces streaked with tears of terror that they didn't yet understand. "Well now," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was somehow more frightening than his earlier shouting. "What have we here? A pretty little widow and her babies. Bet your husband left you with a nice nest egg before he went and got himself killed." Martha's voice came out as barely a whisper, trembling like autumn leaves in a winter wind. "Please, we have nothing of value. We're just here for Sunday service. We don't want any trouble." Morrison stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, each footfall like a countdown to violence. His men continued their systematic destruction behind him, overturning pews with crashes that made the congregation flinch. Old Henrik Larson tried to stand up to help steady a falling elderly woman, but Pike shoved him back down with enough force to send the old man tumbling. "Oh, but sweetheart," Morrison continued, now close enough to Martha that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruelty in his dark eyes. "Trouble's exactly what we bring. And you got something I want. Maybe not money, but something just as valuable. Father Samuel's voice cut through the chaos with surprising authority, his words carrying across the chapel despite their quiet tone. Sir, I must insist that you leave these people be. Whatever grievance has brought you here, it's with me as the shepherd of this flock. There's no need to involve innocent families. Morrison turned toward the preacher with theatrical surprise, as though he'd forgotten the old man was there. Well, would you look at that, boys? The shepherd wants to protect his sheep. How noble. How Christian. He took several steps toward Father Samuel, his hand resting casually on the grip of his revolver. Tell me, preacher man, what exactly you planning to do about it? Father Samuel remained perfectly still behind his pulpit, his hands visible and empty, his pale blue eyes meeting Morrison's stare without wavering. His voice when he spoke remained calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it now, something that hadn't been there during his sermon about forgiveness and turning the other cheek. I'm asking you politely to take what you came for and leave this place of worship in peace. These people have done you no harm. They deserve the sanctuary that God's house provides. Morrison's laughter was harsh and mocking, joined by the cruel chuckles of his men who had paused in their destruction to watch the confrontation unfold. The outlaw leader clapped his hands slowly, the sound echoing through the chapel like gunshots. Sanctuary, he repeated, drawing the word out like it was something distasteful in his mouth. That's real touching, old man. Real Christian of you. But see, I don't much care what your God thinks about sanctuary. I got my own ideas about what this place is good for. Without warning, Morrison spun back toward Martha Whitfield and grabbed her by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to make her cry out in pain. Her daughters screamed and tried to cling to their mother, but Morrison backhanded little Lucy away with casual violence, sending the 80-year-old tumbling between the pews. Now this, Morrison announced, dragging Martha to her feet as she struggled weakly against his grip. This is what I call a proper Sunday collection. Maybe we keep the pretty widow, let her work off whatever debt her dead husband might have owed to honest businessmen like ourselves. The transformation in the chapel was immediate and profound. Martha's terrified sobs mixed with her daughter's screams as they crawled toward their mother on hands and knees, their Sunday dresses torn and dirty from the fall. The rest of the congregation seemed to shrink even further into themselves, several of the elderly women covering their faces with their hands rather than witness what was unfolding. But it was the change in Father Samuel that would have caught the attention of anyone who had known him before he found religion. The gentle preacher's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders squaring beneath his simple black coat. His hands, which had been resting peacefully on his Bible, now gripped the edges of the pulpit with enough force to make his knuckles show white through weathered skin. Release her, Father Samuel said, and his voice had changed completely. The gentle authority was gone, replaced by something cold and flat and absolutely certain. This is God's house. Release her now. Morrison looked back at the preacher with genuine surprise, his grip still tight on Martha's arm as she whimpered and tried to pull away. The outlaw's eyebrows raised in mock amazement as he glanced around at his men with exaggerated disbelief. Boys, did you hear that? The old fool's giving me orders. In case you didn't notice, preacher, there's 6 of us with guns and 1 of you with a prayer book. What exactly you think is going to happen here? Father Samuel's pale blue eyes had gone winter cold, the color of ice on a mountain lake in January. For just a moment, something flickered behind them, something that had nothing to do with scripture or sermons or turning the other cheek. It was there and gone so quickly that most of the terrified congregation missed it entirely, but Morrison was looking right at him when it happened. I'm asking you one more time, Father Samuel said, his voice now carrying an undertone that seemed to make the very air in the chapel grow heavy. Leave this place. Take whatever money you can find and go. Don't make me ask again. Morrison's response was to laugh even louder than before, a sound like breaking glass that filled the chapel from floor to ceiling. He released Martha's arm only to grab her by the hair, pulling her head back to expose her throat as his other hand moved to the knife at his belt. Make you ask again, he repeated between gasps of cruel laughter. Old man, what you gonna do? Bore us to death with Bible verses? Pray us into submission maybe? Your God ain't here, and if he was, I'd spit in his face just like I'm about to do to his altar. Morrison released Martha with a shove that sent her sprawling to the floor beside her crying daughters, then strode purposefully toward the front of the chapel. Each step seemed to echo with deliberate blasphemy as he approached the simple altar where Father Samuel conducted communion every Sunday. The congregation watched in horrified silence as Morrison gathered saliva in his mouth and then spat directly onto the white cloth that covered the sacred table. The desecration seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, contaminating the chapel that had been consecrated decades earlier by faithful men who believed in the sanctity of holy ground. Morrison turned back toward Father Samuel with his revolver now drawn and pointed directly at the preacher's chest, the weapon steady in his experienced hand. "There's your sanctuary, preacher man," Morrison snarled, his face twisted with the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoyed destroying what others held sacred. "There's your God's protection. Now I'm going to ask you one more time, and this time you better have the right answer. Where do you keep the real money in this holy dump?" Morrison's revolver remained steady as he cocked the hammer with his thumb, the metallic click echoing through the chapel like the sound of fate itself being set into motion. The barrel pointed directly at Father Samuel's chest, close enough that the preacher could see down the dark bore that promised death with the simple squeeze of a finger. Morrison's face twisted into a mask of cruel anticipation as he prepared to end the life of a man whose only crime had been standing between predators and their prey. The rest of Morrison's gang had positioned themselves throughout the chapel like wolves preparing for a final kill, their weapons trained on the terrified congregation to ensure no heroic interventions would complicate their leader's murder of the town preacher. Pike kept his Colt aimed at old Henrik Larson, while Nash covered the weeping widow and her daughters with casual indifference. The other three spread out to block any potential escape routes, though none of the frightened townspeople showed any inclination toward resistance. Father Samuel stood perfectly still behind his pulpit, his pale blue eyes fixed on Morrison's face with an expression that seemed almost serene despite the weapon pointed at his heart. His weathered hands remained visible on either side of his Bible, steady and unthreatening, giving no indication of the thoughts that might be moving behind those winter-cold eyes. The transformation that had begun when Morrison first laid hands on Martha Whitfield continued to deepen, though it remained subtle enough that only the most observant might notice the slight shift in his posture. The way his breathing had become more controlled, more purposeful. "You got about 10 seconds to tell me where you keep the church funds," Morrison growled, his finger tightening on the trigger until the weapon trembled with the pressure. "After that, I'm going to paint these holy walls with your brains and ask your congregation real nice if they prefer to keep breathing or keep playing dumb." The chapel doors, already damaged from the outlaw's violent entrance, suddenly burst open again with a crash that made everyone except Father Samuel flinch. A young man in a deputy's badge and worn leather vest stumbled through the entrance, drawn by the sounds of commotion and destruction that had been echoing through Harmony Creek's quiet streets. Deputy Marcus Webb was barely 23 years old, with the kind of earnest face that belonged to someone who still believed that good would always triumph over evil if given enough time and determination. Webb's hand dropped instinctively toward his sidearm when he saw the scene before him, but he froze when he realized he was facing 6 armed men who had already drawn their weapons. His young face went pale as he took in the overturned pews, the scattered pages of the Bible, the terrified congregation huddled together like sheep before wolves. But it was the sight of the elderly preacher standing calmly behind his pulpit with Morrison's gun aimed at his chest that made the deputy's blood run cold. "Jesus Christ," Webb breathed, his voice barely audible in the tense silence that had fallen over the chapel. "What the hell is going on here?" Morrison's head snapped toward the newcomer with irritation, his gun never wavering from Father Samuel's chest. His men shifted their aim to cover the deputy, creating a crossfire that would cut down the young lawman before he could even clear leather if he tried anything foolish. Well, Morrison said with mock pleasantry, "looks like the local law decided to join our Sunday service. How thoughtful. Deputy, I suggest you turn around and walk away real slow unless you want to join the preacher in whatever afterlife they're preaching about these days." But Deputy Webb wasn't looking at Morrison anymore. His attention had become completely focused on Father Samuel's face, studying the weathered features with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that had been nagging at him for years. The deputy's eyes widened as recognition began to dawn, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of horrified awe. "Dear God," Webb whispered, his voice rising in pitch as the impossible truth settled into his mind. "You're Samuel Cross." The name fell into the chapel's tense atmosphere like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of confusion through Morrison's gang and causing several members of the congregation to look up with sudden, sharp attention. Even Martha Whitfield stopped her quiet sobbing to stare at the preacher she had known for nearly 3 years, the gentle man who had officiated at her husband's funeral and comforted her children through their darkest hours. Morrison's confidence flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself with the stubborn arrogance of a man who had never encountered an opponent he couldn't intimidate or kill. "Who the hell is Samuel Cross?" he demanded, his gun still trained on Father Samuel's chest. "Some kind of famous preacher or something." Deputy Webb took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving away from his weapon as though the very idea of drawing on the man behind the pulpit had become unthinkable. His voice shook as he spoke, the words coming out in a rush of barely controlled terror and respect. "The preacher," he said, the capital letters clearly audible in his tone. "They called him the preacher. Before he found God, before he came to Harmony Creek, he was the deadliest gunfighter who ever lived." Morrison's laughter was harsh and disbelieving, but there was an edge to it now that hadn't been there before, a note of uncertainty that suggested the outlaw leader was beginning to sense that the situation might not be as simple as he had assumed. The rest of his gang looked toward their leader for guidance, their weapons still raised, but their confidence clearly shaken by the deputy's obvious fear. "You're trying to tell me," Morrison said, his voice rising as he attempted to reassert control over the situation, "that this old Bible thumper used to be some kind of gunfighter. Look at him, boy. He's 70 years old and probably can't even see straight without those spectacles." But Deputy Webb was shaking his head with the vehemence of a man trying to convince someone to step back from a cliff edge. "He trained Wild Bill Hickok," the deputy said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain. "And John Wesley Hardin, and a dozen others whose names are written in blood across half the territories. They say he never lost a gunfight in 20 years of killing." Father Samuel had remained silent throughout this exchange, watching Morrison's face with the patient attention of a man who understood that sometimes the truth needed time to sink in before it could be properly appreciated. But now he spoke, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had delivered countless sermons, though underneath it ran something that had nothing to do with scripture or salvation. "That's not quite accurate, Deputy Webb," he said quietly, his pale eyes never leaving Morrison's increasingly uncertain face. 22 years. And it was 43 men, not counting the war. All good shoots, all legal, all necessary. The chapel fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the nervous breathing of the congregation and the slight creak of leather as Morrison's grip shifted on his weapon. The outlaw leader's confidence was visibly cracking now, his face cycling between disbelief, anger, and the first cold touch of genuine fear. "Morrison still doesn't understand," Father Samuel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly to every corner of the chapel. "So I'll explain it simply. I found God after I retired my guns, son. Found peace in His Word and His forgiveness. But some lessons, once learned, you never truly forget." The transformation in Father Samuel's posture was becoming more pronounced now, though it happened so gradually that it was like watching the sun set. His shoulders squared imperceptibly beneath his simple black coat, and his stance shifted from that of an elderly preacher to something far more balanced and purposeful. His hands, still resting on either side of his Bible, seemed somehow more dangerous despite their continued stillness. "You're lying," Morrison said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. His gun wavered slightly as doubt began to eat away at his certainty. "Preachers don't kill people. Men of God don't have blood on their hands." Father Samuel's smile was gentle and infinitely sad, the expression of a man who had made peace with a violent past but still carried the weight of every life he had been forced to take. His pale blue eyes seemed to look through Morrison and his gang to some distant place where younger men had made the same mistake of underestimating the quiet figure before them. "Son," he said softly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth, "I've killed more men than you've probably met in your entire life. Every one of them gave me cause. Every one of them made the same mistake you're making right now. They thought an old man with gray in his beard had forgotten how to be dangerous." The silence that followed these words was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of revealed truth and impending violence. Morrison's gang exchanged uncertain glances, their weapons still raised but their confidence shattered by the calm certainty in Father Samuel's voice. Even the terrified congregation seemed to sense that the balance of power in the chapel was shifting in ways they couldn't fully understand. Deputy Webb backed slowly toward the chapel doors, his young face white with the understanding of what was about to unfold. He had heard the stories, read the reports, studied the legend of the preacher in the files at the territorial marshal's office. He knew exactly what happened when Samuel Cross decided that talking was finished and justice needed to be dispensed at the end of a gun barrel. Morrison tried to reassert his dominance through volume and bluster, raising his voice as though sheer noise could somehow restore his advantage. "I don't care who you used to be, old man. Right now you're just another preacher with a death wish. You want to meet your God so bad. I'm happy to arrange the introduction." But Father Samuel was no longer listening to Morrison's threats. His attention had shifted inward, to a place where prayers and gunfire had once walked hand in hand, where justice had been dispensed with surgical precision by a man who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to remove those who preyed upon them permanently. Father Samuel stepped back from the front edge of his pulpit with the deliberate movements of a man who had made a decision that could not be unmade. The gentle preacher who had been delivering sermons about forgiveness and mercy was disappearing before the eyes of everyone in the chapel, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. His weathered hands moved with surprising steadiness as he reached beneath the simple wooden structure that had served as his platform for spreading God's word for the past 3 years. Morrison and his gang watched with growing unease as the elderly man's entire demeanor continued its remarkable transformation. The stooped posture was straightening, the gentle expression hardening into something cold and professional. Even his breathing had changed, becoming more controlled, more purposeful, like a master craftsman preparing to demonstrate skills that had been dormant but never forgotten. "What the hell you think you're doing, old man?" Morrison demanded, his voice rising in pitch as uncertainty began to replace his earlier confidence. His revolver remained trained on Father Samuel, but the outlaw's grip was no longer as steady as it had been moments before. The recognition in Deputy Webb's eyes and the fear in his voice had planted seeds of doubt that were rapidly growing into something approaching panic. Father Samuel's hands disappeared beneath the pulpit for a moment, his movements hidden from view as he reached into a space that most of the congregation had never imagined might conceal anything more dangerous than spare hymnals. When his hands emerged, they carried instruments of death that seemed to transform the very air in the chapel with their presence. Twin Colt peacemakers, their blue steel barrels gleaming despite their age, their grips carved from rich walnut that had been worn smooth by years of use. But it was the intricate engravings on those grips that caught the light and told the true story of the man who had carried these weapons through 2 decades of violence and justice. On the right-hand gun, carved in delicate script, were the words for Mary, my salvation. On the left, equally beautiful and equally meaningful, the inscription read from Mary, my redemption. The congregation gasped collectively as Father Samuel lifted the weapons with the familiarity of a man handling old friends. Martha Whitfield stared in shock at the gentle preacher who had comforted her children and spoken words of peace over her husband's grave, trying to reconcile that image with the figure now standing before them with instruments of death in his weathered hands. "These belong to my wife," Father Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying across the chapel with the authority of absolute truth. "She carved those words herself before she passed, blessed them with her own hands before I retired them. As sacred to me as any cross, as holy as any prayer." Morrison's gang had spread out across the chapel during the confrontation, but now they found themselves in a tactical nightmare. Their leader's attention was focused entirely on the preacher, while the rest of them were scattered among overturned pews and frightened civilians, their lines of fire compromised by the very people they had been terrorizing. Pike stood near the altar, Nash by the damaged entrance, while the other three had positioned themselves along the chapel's sides with no clear shots at their primary target. The first shot came without warning, a thunderclap of sound that seemed to shake the chapel's foundation and leave everyone's ears ringing in its aftermath. Father Samuel's right-hand Colt had appeared in his grip and fired in a single fluid motion that was almost too fast for the human eye to follow. The bullet took Pike squarely in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the altar he had desecrated only minutes before. The scarred outlaw was dead before he hit the floor, his eyes wide with the surprise of a man who had never imagined death could come so suddenly or so precisely. Morrison's remaining men reacted with the desperate speed of cornered animals, bringing their weapons to bear on the preacher who had just demonstrated exactly why his reputation had survived 20 years of retirement. But Father Samuel was already moving, his body flowing between the overturned pews with a grace that belied his age, both Colts now in his hands, and speaking their deadly language with mechanical precision. Nash tried to bring his rifle to bear, but found himself facing an opponent who moved like smoke and shadow, appearing and disappearing behind cover with the practiced ease of a man who had survived countless gunfights by never being where his enemies expected him to be. Father Samuel's left-hand gun barked once, the bullet taking Nash in the shoulder and spinning him around to crash through one of the chapel's modest windows in a shower of glass and splintered wood. The remaining 3 gang members tried to coordinate their fire, but they were dealing with something beyond their experience or training. This wasn't the confused scramble of a typical gunfight between men of roughly equal skill. This was a master craftsman at work, every movement calculated, every shot placed with surgical precision, every tactical decision made with the cold efficiency of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of killing. Morrison himself had backed toward the front of the chapel, his own weapon forgotten as he watched his carefully assembled gang of hardened killers being dismantled by a single elderly man with gray in his beard and scripture in his heart. The outlaw leader's face had gone pale as understanding finally penetrated his arrogance. This wasn't some doddering preacher who had gotten lucky with an old gun. This was Samuel Cross, the preacher, the man whose name was whispered in saloons and spoke of in the same breath as Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp. In desperation, Morrison lunged toward Martha Whitfield, who was still huddled on the floor with her terrified daughters. His arms snaked around her throat as he dragged her to her feet, using her body as a shield between himself and the deadly figure who was methodically eliminating his men with the detached professionalism of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. "That's far enough, old man," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he pressed his revolver against Martha's temple. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the raw desperation of a cornered animal. "Drop those guns, or the widow gets her brains painted all over these holy walls." Father Samuel froze in place, his twin Colts still smoking from their recent use, his pale blue eyes fixed on Morrison with an intensity that seemed to burn. The chapel fell silent except for Martha's terrified whimpering and the labored breathing of Nash, who was still alive but bleeding heavily from his shoulder wound. The remaining 2 gang members kept their weapons trained on the preacher, but their hands shook with the understanding that they were facing something far beyond their capability to handle. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt like hours to everyone involved. Father Samuel stood perfectly still, his weapons lowered but not holstered, his gaze calculating angles and distances with the cold precision of a man who had solved similar problems many times before. Morrison pressed his gun harder against Martha's head, his finger trembling on the trigger as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Then Father Samuel moved. The motion was so sudden and so precise that it seemed almost supernatural. His right-hand Colt rose and fired in a single fluid gesture that took perhaps a quarter of a second from beginning to end. The bullet struck Morrison's gun hand with perfect accuracy, shattering bone and sending the outlaw's weapon spinning away to clatter harmlessly across the chapel floor. Morrison screamed and released Martha, who collapsed to her knees and crawled frantically toward her daughters. The outlaw leader clutched his ruined hand against his chest, blood seeping between his fingers as he stared in shock and agony at the man who had just demonstrated a level of marksmanship that bordered on the impossible. 22 years, Father Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel despite its gentle tone. Never missed a shot I meant to take. Never hit anything I didn't mean to hit. That includes pretty widows who deserve better than to be used as shields by cowards. The two remaining gang members looked at their wounded leader, then at their dead and dying companions, then at the elderly preacher who held their lives in his weathered hands. Without a word, they turned and ran for the chapel doors, abandoning their weapons in their haste to escape the wrath of a legend they had been foolish enough to underestimate. Father Samuel watched them go without pursuit, his Colt still ready but no longer needed. Nash had lost consciousness from blood loss, his rifle lying forgotten beside the broken window. Pike lay motionless beside the altar, his sightless eyes staring at the chapel ceiling where morning sunlight still streamed through stained glass windows that had witnessed the resurrection of a killer who had thought himself retired from the business of death. Morrison knelt on the chapel floor, cradling his shattered hand and staring up at Father Samuel with eyes that held no more arrogance, no more cruelty, only the desperate understanding of a man who had finally encountered an opponent he could neither intimidate nor overcome. The outlaw's face was gray with shock and pain, his earlier confidence replaced by the terrible knowledge that he was completely at the mercy of someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to kill. The congregation remained frozen in their pews, afraid to move or speak, afraid to do anything that might disturb the deadly calm that had settled over their violated sanctuary. They stared at their preacher as though seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had delivered countless sermons about peace and forgiveness with the figure who now stood over his fallen enemies with smoking guns in his hands and winter in his eyes. Father Samuel approached Morrison slowly, his twin Colts still smoking from their deadly work, his weathered boots making no sound on the chapel floor that was now stained with blood and marked by violence. The outlaw leader had collapsed against the very altar he had desecrated with his spit, his ruined right hand pressed against his chest, while his left scrambled desperately for purchase on the white cloth that covered the communion table. His face had gone the color of old ash, pain and shock combining with the terrible understanding that he was now completely at the mercy of a man whose reputation had been built on precisely measured violence. The congregation watched in absolute silence, their earlier terror replaced by a kind of awed fascination as they witnessed their gentle preacher moving with the deadly grace of a predator closing in for the kill. Martha Whitfield had gathered her daughters to her chest, all three of them staring at Father Samuel as though seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile the man who had comforted them through their darkest hours with the figure who now stood over Morrison's broken form with winter-cold eyes and death in his hands. Behind them, old Henrik Larsson gripped his walking stick with white knuckles, his aged face reflecting the same mixture of fear and fascination that had gripped everyone in the violated sanctuary. These people had known Samuel Cross as their preacher for 3 years, had listened to his gentle sermons about forgiveness and redemption, had watched him comfort the grieving and bless their children. Now they were seeing the man he had been before God called him to a different path, and the transformation was both terrifying and magnificent in its completeness. Morrison tried to speak, his voice coming out as little more than a strangled whisper as pain from his shattered hand combined with the shock of absolute defeat. "You're a man of God," he gasped, his words barely audible over the sound of his own labored breathing. "You can't just murder us in cold blood. You took holy vows. You're supposed to forgive, not kill." Father Samuel stopped directly in front of the wounded outlaw, his pale blue eyes looking down at Morrison with an expression that held no mercy, but also no hatred, only the cold certainty of a man who understood the difference between justice and vengeance. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried clearly through the chapel, each word measured and deliberate. "Son," he said, the gentleness in his tone making his words somehow more frightening than any shout of anger could have been, "I'm not here to murder anyone. Murder is what you and your men were planning to do to these innocent people. What I'm offering you is judgment." Morrison's eyes darted around the chapel, looking for escape routes that didn't exist, for weapons that were no longer within reach, for any possible salvation from the terrible situation his arrogance had created. His breathing was rapid and shallow, the kind of panicked gasping that came from a man who could feel death approaching with measured steps. Father Samuel holstered his left-hand Colt with a smooth motion, keeping his right weapon ready, but pointed toward the floor rather than at Morrison's head. The gesture was somehow more frightening than keeping both guns trained on the wounded outlaw, suggesting a confidence so complete that the preacher could afford such apparent carelessness. "Let me explain what your men did in the towns you passed through on your way here," Father Samuel continued, his voice taking on the tone he might use when delivering a particularly important sermon. "Your friend Pike, the one lying dead beside this altar, he raped and murdered a 14-year-old girl outside of Millerville 2 weeks ago, left her body for the coyotes, and bragged about it in 3 different saloons." Morrison's face went even paler if such a thing were possible, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The congregation listened in horrified fascination as their preacher recited crimes with the precision of a man who had clearly made it his business to know exactly who he was dealing with. Nash, the one bleeding by that broken window, he burned down a family's farmhouse outside of Cedar Falls with the parents and their baby son still inside. Did it because they couldn't pay his protection money. 3 innocent lives lost because your man decided their suffering was entertaining. Father Samuel's voice never rose above its conversational tone, but each word seemed to carry the weight of divine judgment. His pale eyes remained fixed on Morrison's face, watching as the outlaw leader's last desperate hopes of mercy died under the accumulated weight of his gang's documented crimes. "As for you, Morrison," Father Samuel continued, "you've been wanted in 3 territories for rape, murder, and robbery. The territorial marshal's office has a file on you thick as my Bible. You killed a shopkeeper in front of his wife and children in Sunset Ridge, shot down a deputy who was trying to surrender in Broken Arrow, burned out 6 families whose only crime was trying to make an honest living on land you decided you wanted for yourself." The silence in the chapel was so complete that Morrison's labored breathing sounded like a bellows working overtime. Even the birds that normally sang outside the stained glass windows seemed to have fallen quiet, as though all of creation was holding its breath to witness this moment of reckoning. "So here's what's going to happen," Father Samuel said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the chapel. "I'm going to give you the same choice I gave every man I ever faced in the old days. You can try to reach that gun you dropped when I shot your hand. You can crawl out of here and never come back to this territory. Or you can sit there and wait for Deputy Webb to arrest you so you can face proper legal justice for your crimes." Morrison's eyes flicked toward his revolver, which lay about 8 feet away near the overturned collection box. The weapon might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do him with a shattered hand, and Father Samuel watching his every move with the patient attention of a hawk studying a wounded rabbit. "But I'm going to tell you something else, son," Father Samuel continued, his tone becoming almost conversational. "If you try for that gun, if you make me kill you in this holy place, you'll be doing it in front of women and children who don't deserve to see any more violence today. So think carefully about what kind of man you want to be in your final moments." Morrison's face cycled through desperation, rage, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse as he stared up at the elderly preacher who held his life in weathered hands. For a moment, it seemed as though the outlaw might actually choose the path of surrender, might accept arrest and legal justice for the crimes he had committed across 3 territories. Then his eyes hardened with the stubborn defiance of a man who had never backed down from a fight, even when backing down was his only hope of survival. Morrison lunged for his fallen weapon with his good hand, his movement telegraphed and clumsy, but driven by the desperate strength of a man who would rather die fighting than live in captivity. His fingers had almost reached the gun's grip when Father Samuel's right-hand Colt appeared in his hand with the fluid speed that had made him a legend. The shot echoed through the chapel like the voice of judgment itself, a thunderclap of finality that seemed to shake the very foundations of the modest building. Morrison's body jerked once and then lay still, his hand inches from the weapon he would never reach, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling where morning sunlight still streamed through stained glass windows that had witnessed both the desecration of holy ground and its ultimate protection. Father Samuel stood over the dead outlaw for a long moment, his smoking Colt held steady in his right hand while his left moved automatically to make the sign of the cross over Morrison's body. Even in death, even after all the violence and blasphemy, the preacher's instinct was to offer what blessing he could to a soul that had chosen its own path to damnation. "May God have mercy on your soul," he said quietly, his words carrying clearly through the chapel despite their gentle tone. "Because I could not." The silence that followed seemed to stretch toward eternity, broken only by Nash's labored breathing from where he lay unconscious beside the broken window, and the soft sobbing of Martha Whitfield as she held her daughters close. The congregation remained frozen in their pews, afraid to move or speak, afraid to disturb the terrible peace that had settled over their violated sanctuary. Father Samuel holstered his right-hand Colt with movements that seemed suddenly heavy and tired, as though the weight of returning to violence had settled onto his shoulders like a physical burden. His hands, which had been rock steady during the gunfight, now trembled slightly as he reached for the altar cloth to cover Morrison's body. The transformation was already beginning to reverse itself, the deadly gunfighter disappearing back into the depths of the gentle preacher who had emerged to protect his flock. But the cost of that protection was written in the lines of his weathered face, in the way his shoulders sagged as though carrying an invisible load, in the slight shake of his hands as he knelt beside the altar where he had served communion every Sunday for 3 years. Father Samuel placed his palms flat against the wooden surface that Morrison had defiled with his spit, his head bowed in prayer, or perhaps in the weight of remembering why he had retired his guns in the first place. "Forgive me," he whispered, his words meant for ears far higher than any human could hear. "Forgive me for bringing violence into your house. Forgive me for taking lives, even lives that had chosen evil. Forgive me for becoming again what I swore I had left behind." The prayer continued in silence, Father Samuel's lips moving without sound as he asked for absolution from sins that had been necessary but were sins nonetheless. The twin Colts remained holstered at his sides, their work finished for now, their blessed grips once again hidden beneath his simple black coat. But everyone in the chapel understood that something fundamental had changed, that their gentle preacher would never again be simply the man who delivered sermons about forgiveness and turning the other cheek. Outside, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Sheriff Coleman and his deputies, drawn by the gunshots that had echoed across Harmony Creek's quiet streets. But inside the chapel, in the space between prayer and violence, between mercy and justice, Father Samuel Cross continued his whispered conversation with a God who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to become something far less than innocent yourself. The morning sunlight still streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbows across a floor now marked by blood and violence, illuminating a sanctuary that had been defiled and defended in equal measure. The price of peace, Father Samuel had learned long ago, was sometimes paid in gunpowder and grief, in necessary sins, and the terrible weight of doing what was right rather than what was comfortable. 3 days after the violence that had shattered the peace of St. Mary's Chapel, the sound of hammers and saws echoed through Harmony Creek as the townspeople worked together to repair the damage Morrison's gang had inflicted upon their sanctuary. The broken window had been boarded up temporarily with fresh pine planks, while local craftsmen worked to fashion new pews to replace those that had been overturned and damaged beyond repair. The pages of the torn Bible had been carefully collected and pressed between heavy books in hopes of preserving what could be saved of the sacred text. Father Samuel worked alongside the others, his weathered hands steady as he helped plane new boards and fit replacement hinges to the chapel doors that had been damaged during the outlaw's violent entrance. But those who knew him well could see the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders, in the way his pale blue eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them, as though he was seeing something in the distance that troubled his spirit. The twin Colts remained holstered beneath his simple black coat, their presence a constant reminder of the man he had been forced to become again in order to protect his flock. He had cleaned and oiled them after the sheriff's investigation was completed, his movements automatic and practiced despite the 3 years that had passed since he last performed such maintenance. The blessed weapons were ready for use again if needed, but Father Samuel prayed with increasing fervor that such need would never arise. Martha Whitfield approached him as he worked to repair the altar rail that had been damaged when Pike fell against it in his final moments. Her daughters stayed close behind her, their small hands clutching at her skirts as they remembered the terror of that Sunday morning when their peaceful world had been shattered by violence. The widow's face showed the strain of recent events, but there was something else there too, a kind of quiet strength that had emerged from surviving such an ordeal. "Father Samuel," she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for him to hear over the sound of construction work around them. "I wanted to thank you for what you did, for protecting us when no one else could." Father Samuel looked up from his work, his pale eyes meeting hers with an expression that held both gentleness and profound sadness. The weight of taking lives, even lives that had chosen evil, was something that never truly left a man's soul, and Martha could see that burden written clearly in the lines of his weathered face. "Mrs. Whitfield," he replied, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had delivered countless sermons, though now it was marked by something that hadn't been there before their sanctuary was violated. "I did what had to be done, but I fear I may have brought something to your town that was better left buried." Martha shook her head with surprising firmness, her own voice growing stronger as she spoke words that had been building inside her since the gunshots fell silent 3 days before. "You brought protection when we needed it most. You stood between evil men and innocent people when no one else could or would. That's not something to be ashamed of, Father. That's something to be grateful for." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Sheriff Coleman, a grizzled man in his 50s whose face bore the lines of someone who had spent decades dealing with the worst that frontier life had to offer. He carried a folder under one arm and moved with the careful deliberation of someone bringing news that might not be entirely welcome. "Father Cross," the sheriff said, using the name by which Samuel had been known in his gunfighting days rather than the simple title he had adopted when he found religion. "Got word back from the territorial marshal's office about Morrison and his gang. Seems they were wanted for more crimes than we initially thought." Sheriff Coleman opened his folder and began reading from official documents that detailed a trail of violence and cruelty stretching across 3 territories and spanning nearly 2 years of increasingly bold criminal activity. The dead men in the chapel had been responsible for the deaths of at least 15 innocent people, including women and children, along with countless acts of robbery, assault, and destruction that had terrorized honest settlers throughout the region. "You saved a lot of lives by stopping them here," the sheriff continued, his voice carrying the grudging respect of a lawman who understood the necessity of violence even when he didn't enjoy its application. "Territorial judge wants to commend you officially for your actions. Says you showed remarkable restraint in offering Morrison the choice to surrender." Father Samuel listened to the sheriff's words without expression, his weathered hands continuing their work on the altar rail, as though the official recognition meant little to him compared to the weight of having been forced to kill again after 3 years of peace. When the sheriff finished speaking, the preacher looked up with eyes that held depths of sorrow and experience that few men could claim. "Sheriff," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the construction noise around them, "I appreciate the judge's words, but commendation isn't what troubles me. What troubles me is whether my presence here brings more danger than protection to these good people." That evening, as the last of the repair work was completed for the day, the townspeople of Harmony Creek gathered in the chapel for an impromptu meeting to discuss their future and the future of the man who had saved them. Old Henrik Larson spoke first, his voice shaky with age but firm with conviction as he addressed the assembled crowd. "I've lived in this town for 40 years, he said, leaning heavily on his walking stick as he stood before his neighbors. "I've seen good times and bad, seen troubles come and go, but I never saw anything like what happened in this holy place 3 days ago. And I never want to see Father Samuel think he's not welcome here, because he had the courage to protect us when we couldn't protect ourselves." One by one, other voices joined the chorus of support. Catherine Wells spoke of how Father Samuel had comforted her family after her husband's accident. Timothy spoke of the guidance the preacher had provided during his troubled teenage years. Martha Whitfield stood with her daughters and spoke of the strength they had drawn from Father Samuel's gentle counsel during their darkest hours. The meeting lasted well into the evening, but when it concluded, the decision was unanimous. The people of Harmony Creek wanted their preacher to stay, understanding now that the gentle man who delivered sermons about forgiveness was also someone who could stand between them and the violence that sometimes found its way to their peaceful community. Father Samuel accepted their decision with the same quiet grace that characterized everything he did, but he made one request that surprised no one who truly understood the burden he carried. The twin colts were returned to their resting place beneath the pulpit, blessed weapons stored in blessed ground, ready if needed, but hopefully never to be drawn again in anger. Months passed, and St. Mary's Chapel developed a reputation that spread far beyond the borders of Harmony Creek. Word traveled through the territories that the little church was protected by the preacher, that anyone who sought genuine sanctuary there would find it, but anyone who came with violence in their hearts would face judgment of a most final kind. Former outlaws began appearing at Sunday services, drawn by stories of a man who had walked the path from violence to redemption and might show them the same way. Father Samuel counseled these broken men with the same gentle patience he showed everyone who sought his guidance, understanding better than most the weight of a violent past and the difficulty of finding peace with blood on one's hands. Some found the redemption they sought and settled in Harmony Creek to build honest lives. Others proved incapable of change and moved on, but none caused trouble in the town where the preacher had chosen to make his final stand. Years passed, and Deputy Webb grew into Sheriff Webb, his badge earned through careful training under both the territorial marshal and Father Samuel himself. The young lawman learned to read scripture and shoot straight with equal proficiency, understanding that sometimes the protection of the innocent required both spiritual strength and practical skills that his mentor had perfected through hard experience. On a warm spring morning, nearly 5 years after the violence that had changed everything, Father Samuel stood before his rebuilt sanctuary as a new bronze bell was raised into the modest tower that the townspeople had constructed to house it. The bell had been cast with money donated by grateful families throughout the territory, people whose lives had been touched by the protection that radiated outward from the little chapel where the preacher had made his stand. The inscription cast into the bronze was simple but profound, words that captured the complex legacy of a man who had found God after a lifetime of violence and discovered that sometimes sacred purposes required sacred weapons. Sacred weapons, sacred purpose, it read, and below that in smaller letters, Mary Cross Memorial, honoring the woman whose love had guided her husband from a path of violence to one of peace, and whose blessed guns had protected the innocent when peace alone was not enough. Father Samuel placed his weathered hands on the rope that would ring the bell for the first time, his pale blue eyes looking out over the growing town that had become his final home. The weight of his past would never fully leave him, but he had found a way to make that weight serve something greater than himself, to transform the skills that had made him a legend into protection for people who deserved to live their lives free from fear. The bell's first toll rang out across Harmony Creek, its bronze voice carrying a message of hope and protection that would echo through the valleys and across the plains where good people struggled to build honest lives in a hard world. It spoke of redemption earned through service, of violence transformed into protection, of a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of faith was not turning the other cheek, but standing between evil and innocence with blessed weapons in blessed hands. If this story of redemption and the complex moral choices we all face has moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between what felt right and what was easy? Sometimes the path to peace requires us to confront the darkness in ourselves and in the world around us. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances and the possibility of redemption, and subscribe for more stories about finding light in the darkest places. Until next time, may you find the courage to protect what matters most, whatever the cost to yourself. As the sun set over Harmony Creek, Father Samuel Cross stood beneath his memorial bell with his congregation gathered around him, a man who had learned that true strength sometimes meant putting aside the weapons of war and sometimes meant taking them up again when innocence called for protection. The twin colts rested beneath his pulpit, blessed and ready, instruments of judgment in the hands of a man who had found his own redemption in serving others. The preacher had found his final sanctuary, not in retirement from the world, but in standing guard over the peace that good people deserve to enjoy.